Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome for the first time. Either way, I am glad you are here. Go ahead and dim those lights. Pull the covers up. Get that pillow situation sorted out. Maybe adjust your phone so it doesn't fall on your face in 20 minutes. We've all been there. No judgment. We're going on a long, slow, gentle journey through one of the oldest continuous civilizations on the planet. We're talking about Persia, or Iran, or both. Because here is the thing, and this is what tonight's whole ramble. And most people think the switch from Persia to Iran happened overnight. Like someone just flipped a sign on the door. But it didn't. It is a story that stretches back so far that by the time we get to the actual official name change in 1935, you'll realize it was less of a dramatic reveal and more of a very long, slow exhale, which is perfect for tonight, because that is exactly the energy we're going for. So let's start at the very beginning. And I do mean the very beginning, like ancient, before the Persian Empire was even a glimmer in anyone's eye. Before Cyrus, before Darius, before anyone was carving anything into a cliff face. Let's talk about a plateau, the Iranian Plateau. It is this massive stretch of land, rugged, dry, mountainous in parts, surprisingly green in others, that sits between Mesopotamia to the west and the Indus Valley to the east. It is kind of the crossroads of the ancient world, and people have been living there for a very, very long time. We're talking early farming communities growing wheat and barley while the rest of the world was still figuring out fire safety. These weren't Persians yet. They were just people living on a plateau, doing plateau things. No, around the second millennium BCE, so roughly 2000 to 1000 BCE. These were Indo-Iranian peoples, part of a larger wave of migration that scholars have spent centuries arguing about. They came from the steppes of Central Asia. Probably. They brought horses. They brought chariots. They brought a language family that would eventually branch into everything from Sanskrit to Farsi, and among these groups were two that matter a lot for our story tonight, the Medes and the Persians. The Medes settled in the northwest part of the plateau, in what is now western Iran. The Persians settled further south, in a region called Parsa, or Pars, or Fars, depending on who is transliterating and how generous they're feeling with vowels, and this is important. Remember that word Pars, because that little regional name is going to echo through literally thousands of years of history and cause a naming headache that still confuses people at dinner parties. So the Medes got organized first. They built a kingdom. They had a capital called Ecbatana, which is modern-day Hamadan. They were doing pretty well. They even helped bring down the Assyrian Empire, which, if you know anything about the Assyrians, was kind of a big deal. The Assyrians were the scary ones. The ones with the wall carvings of people being flayed alive. Lovely people. Great at interior decorating. The Persians, meanwhile, were technically their subjects. Or at least they were in a subordinate position. A vassal state, if you want to be formal about it. The Persians had their own local kings ruling over their little corner of the plateau, paying tribute to the Medes, and probably quietly resenting it, because that is what vassal states do. They pay taxes and hold grudges. And then along came a man named Cyrus. Cyrus II, later known as Cyrus the Great. And honestly, for once, the great title is pretty well earned. This guy was born around 600 BCE, give or take, and he was the king of Anshan, a small Persian kingdom. His family, the Achaemenids, had been ruling this little patch of land for a few generations. Nothing spectacular, just a minor royal house in the shadow of the Median Empire. But Cyrus had ambitions. Of course he did. They always do. Around 550 BCE, Cyrus revolted against the Median king. No, Astyages was supposedly Cyrus's grandfather on his mother's side, which makes this a family dispute as much as a political one. There is a whole legend about how Astyages had a dream that his grandson would overthrow him, so he tried to have baby Cyrus killed, but the servant tasked with the job couldn't go through with it, and gave the baby to a shepherd instead. Sound familiar? It should. This story gets recycled in about 40 different cultures. Moses. Everyone's got a version of king tries to kill prophesied baby. Baby survives. Baby grows up to fulfill the prophecy anyway. It is the ancient world's favorite plot device. Whether or not the legend is true, and it is probably not, at least not in that neater package. Cyrus did overthrow Astyages. The Median army reportedly mutinied and handed their king over. Just like that. One day you are the ruler of the dominant power in Western Asia. The next day your own soldiers are like, yeah, we're going with the other guy. Sorry. And with that, Cyrus became the ruler of both the Medes and the Persians. He didn't destroy the Median state. He absorbed it. He kept Median nobles in positions of power. He presented himself not as a conqueror but as a unifier. This was smart. This was very smart because it set the template for how the Persian Empire would operate for the next 2 centuries. No, here is where the name thing starts to get interesting. Cyrus and his people called themselves Persians, from the region of Pars. But the Medes had been the ones everyone else in the ancient world. So the Greeks, who were watching all of this from across the Aegean Sea, initially called the whole empire Media. Then they gradually shifted to calling it Persia, after the Persians who were now clearly in charge. But they got the name from the Greek rendering of Pars. They called it Persis, and the people per se. And eventually, the whole empire, the whole civilization, the whole region became Persia in the Western imagination. But here is the thing. The people living there, they never called themselves Persians. No, really no. In the way the West used the term, they had a different word, an older word, a word that comes from the same root as Aryan, and before you get weird about it, that word originally just meant noble or of good family in old Iranian. The land was Iransha, the realm of the Aryans, the land of the noble people, Iran. So from the very beginning, there were 2 names. The outside name, Persia, given by the Greeks and adopted by the rest of the Western world, and the inside name, Iran, used by the people who actually lived there, 2 names. Same place, running in parallel for over 2,000 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to Cyrus. He has just taken over the Median Empire, and he is not done. No, even close. After consolidating his control over the Medes, his next target was Lydia, a wealthy kingdom in what is now Western Turkey. The king of Lydia was Croesus. Yes, that Croesus. Rich as Croesus. The guy was famously wealthy. He had so much gold that his name became a literal idiom for being loaded. And according to Herodotus, who is our main source for a lot of this, and who should always be taken with a generous pinch of salt, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi before going to war with Cyrus. The oracle told him that if he crossed the river, a great empire would fall. A great empire fell. His own. Because oracles are like that. They're the original terms, and conditions fine print. Cyrus defeated Croesus around 547 BCE and absorbed Lydia into his growing empire. Then he turned east and conquered vast stretches of Central Asia. Then, in 539 BCE, he did the really big one. He conquered Babylon. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. One of the most famous cities in the ancient world. And Cyrus took it, reportedly, without a major battle. The Babylonian king, Nabonidus, was unpopular. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, were unhappy. Cyrus basically walked in, said, "I am in charge now," and everyone sort of shrugged and went along with it. He even issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document that declared religious tolerance, freed captive peoples, and restored temples. Some people call it the first declaration of human rights. That is a bit of a stretch. But it was remarkably progressive for 539 BCE. The guy conquered half of the known world, and somehow came out of it with a reputation for being nice. And just like that, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was born. It stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. And it was built by a guy from a minor kingdom in southern Iran who just kept winning. Cyrus died around 530 BCE, probably in battle. There is a grim story about the Massagetae queen, Tamiris, dunking his severed head in a vessel of blood and saying something like, "You wanted blood, here. Drink your fill," which is either deeply poetic or deeply disturbing, depending on your mood. Either way, Cyrus was gone, but his empire was very much alive, and it is here that we should pause and just breathe for a second. Take a slow breath in, let it out. We've covered a lot of ground. We've gone from the Iranian Plateau to the founding of the largest empire in the ancient world. We've introduced the two names, Persia and Iran, and started to untangle why they both exist. No, let's keep going because things are about to get even more interesting. In a calm, gentle, I am learning about ancient bureaucracy, and it is weirdly soothing kind of way. So Cyrus was dead, and the empire needed a new boss. His son, Cambyses II, took over. Cambyses is one of those historical figures who gets a bit of a rough deal in the sources. Mostly because the guy who came after him had a very strong interest in making him look bad. But we know is this: Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, adding yet another ancient civilization to the Persian collection. He reportedly went a little off the rails after that. There are stories about him killing sacred bulls, going mad, and generally being saint. Herodotus paints him as a tyrant. But Herodotus also had a flair for the dramatic, so take it as you will. Cambyses died in 522 BCE under mysterious circumstances. Possibly suicide, possibly an accident, possibly something more sinister, and the empire was thrown into chaos. There was a succession crisis involving a man who may or may not have been Cambyses' brother Bardia, or may have been an impostor pretending to be Bardia. It is confusing. Ancient Persian politics were like a soap opera written by someone who kept losing track of the characters. Out of this mess emerged Darius. Darius, later known as Darius the Great. He was a member of the Achaemenid family, but from a different branch than Cyrus. He seized the throne, put down revolts across the empire, and then, in what is perhaps the most impressive PowerPoint presentation in ancient history, he had the whole story carved into a cliff face at Behistun, the Behistun inscription. It is enormous. It is in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and it basically says, "Everyone who disagreed with me was a liar, and I defeated them all. You are welcome." It is propaganda, obviously, but it is beautifully executed propaganda, and it was crucial for modern scholars because it helped them decipher cuneiform script, much like the Rosetta Stone did for hieroglyphics. Darius was, by most accounts, an excellent administrator. If Cyrus was the guy who built the empire, Darius was the guy who organized it. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. He standardized weights and measures. He introduced a common currency, the gold daric. He built roads, most famously, the Royal Road, which stretched from Sardis in western Turkey all the way to Susa in southwestern Iran. It was about 1,600 miles long, and the Persian postal system could cover it in about a week using relay riders. Herodotus was so impressed by this that he wrote the famous line, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds," which, yes, is the same quote that is associated with the United States Postal Service. The Persians invented reliable mail delivery. You are welcome, Amazon. Darius also built Persepolis, or rather, he started building it. Persepolis, Parsa, in Old Persian, was a ceremonial capital, a showcase of imperial power and artistic achievement. It is in the Fars province, the Pars region. See how that name keeps coming back. The ruins are still there today in southern Iran, and they're stunning. Massive columns, intricate reliefs showing delegations from across the empire, bringing tribute lions, bulls, winged figures. It is the kind of place that makes you realize the ancient world was way more sophisticated than we sometimes give it credit for. No, Darius also did something less successful. He picked a fight with the Greeks, the Greco-Persian Wars. You've probably heard of them: Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. They're some of the most famous military engagements in Western history, largely because the Greeks won and then wrote extensively about how awesome they were for winning. The Persians, for their part, probably considered the whole Greek situation a minor frontier annoyance. The empire was enormous. Greece was a collection of small, fractious city-states on the western edge of things. But the Greeks turned their resistance into the founding myth of Western civilization, and so the Persian Wars became legendary. Darius launched the first major invasion of Greece in 490 BCE. It ended at the Battle of Marathon, where the Athenians, against significant odds, defeated the Persian landing force. Darius was reportedly furious. He planned a much larger invasion, but he died in 486 BCE before he could carry it out. The task fell to his son, Xerxes, sometimes called Xerxes the Great, though Xerxes the Ambitious might be more accurate. Xerxes assembled one of the largest armies the ancient world had ever seen. Herodotus claims it was over 1 million men, which is almost certainly a massive exaggeration, but it was still very, very big, and marched on Greece in 480 BCE. This is where we get Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans, the whole Molon Labe thing, which, for the record, means come and take them. And it is what Leonidas supposedly said when Xerxes demanded the Greeks surrender their weapons. It is a great line, very cinematic. The Spartans held the pass for a few days before being outflanked. It was a tactical defeat, but a propaganda victory that echoes to this day. Xerxes pushed on. He actually captured and burned Athens. The Athenians had a still. He burned it. That is a statement. But then the Greek fleet, led by the Athenian general Themistocles, destroyed the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis, and the following year, the Greek allies defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea. Xerxes went home. The Greek adventure was over. No, from the Persian perspective, this was embarrassing but not catastrophic. The empire was still massive, still wealthy, still functioning, but Xerxes seems to have lost some of his spark. After Greece, he focused on building projects most of fitness and Pasipal. He was assassinated in 465 BCE by Artabanus, the commander of his royal guard, because of course it was the head of security. It is always the head of security. After Xerxes, the Achaemenid Empire entered a long, slow period of decline. There were more kings. Artaxerxes I, Darius II, Artaxerxes III, and they all had varying degrees of competence. There were rebellions. There were palace intrigues. Egypt broke away and had to be reconquered. Satraps got a little too. Empire was still there, still large, still impressive on paper. But the energy was fading, like a phone at 15%. Still working, but you can feel the end coming. And the end, when it came, had a name, a very famous name. But not Roosh. Let's take a moment here. Breathe ye. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, or the couch, or wherever you are. We're about to watch an empire fall, and I want you to be comfortable for it. It is going to happen slowly, gently, like a very large, very ancient sandcastle. Meeting the tide actually. No, it happened incredibly fast, but we'll tell it slowly, because that is what we do here. Let's talk about the name situation again for a moment, because it is important context. Throughout this entire Achaemenid period, roughly 550 to 330 BCE, the empire was known in the West as the Persian Empire. The Greeks called it that. Western historians have called it that ever since, but within the empire itself, the concept of Iran or Iran Shah was already present. The people spoke Iranian languages. They identified as part of a broader Iranian cultural world. The name Persia was always an outsider's label, based on one province, one region. It is a bit like if the entire United States was called Virginia. So even in the golden age of the Achaemenid Empire, there were already two names, two identities, one for export, one for home use. All right, Alexander III of Macedon. Alexander the Great, history's most overachieving 20-something. He became king of Macedon in 336 BC after his father, Philip, was assassinated. Philip had already unified Greece under Macedonian control. So Alexander inherited a powerful military machine and a plan to invade the Persian Empire, which he did. Because Alexander was not the type to sit around and think things over. He crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BCE with about 40,000 troops. He won his first major battle against the Persians at the Granicus River. Then he won again at Issus in 333 BCE, where he faced the Persian king Darius III personally. Darius fled the battlefield. His family was captured. His war chest was seized. It was not a great day for Darius. Alexander then swept down the Mediterranean coast, taking Tyre and Egypt, where he founded Alexandria because modest naming conventions were not his thing, before turning east to deliver the final blow, the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE. This was the big one. Darius III assembled a massive army on a flat plain in what is now northern Iraq, choosing terrain that would favor his superior numbers and his chariots. Alexander attacked anyway, because of course he did, and he won decisively. Darius fled again. His empire crumbled. Alexander marched into Babylon. He marched into Susa. He marched into Persepolis. And at Persepolis, something happened that historians have debated ever since. Alexander burned it. The great ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, with its magnificent halls and intricate reliefs, was set on fire. Some sources say it was deliberate revenge for Xerxes burning Athens 150 years earlier. Others say it happened during a drunken party and got out of hand. Either way, Persepolis burned. And with it, symbolically at least, the Achaemenid Empire ended. Darius III was eventually murdered by his own men while fleeing east. Alexander reportedly found his body and gave him a proper royal burial, which was either a genuine act of respect or a brilliant piece of political theatre. Probably both. No? Here is something interesting. Alexander didn't just conquer the Persian Empire. He tried to become it. He adopted Persian dress. He incorporated Persian nobles into his administration. He married Roxana, a princess from Bactria, modern Afghanistan, and later also married Stytira, a daughter of Darius. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian women. He wanted to fuse Gari-Kak and Persian culture into something new. The Persians or Iranians or whatever we're calling them this century were not simply erased by Alexander's conquest. Their culture was too deep, too old, too entrenched. Alexander recognized this. He tried to work with it rather than against it. Whether this was genuine admiration or cold political calculation is a question for smarter people than me, probably both. Again, Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was 32, possibly from fever, possibly from poison, possibly from the cumulative effect of drinking too much and getting stabbed too often. His empire immediately fell apart because he hadn't bothered to arrange a clear succession. Classic Alexander. Great at conquering, terrible at paperwork. What followed was a period of chaos, known as the Wars of the Diadochi. The successors. Alexander's generals fought each other for pieces of his empire. Eventually, things settled into a few major kingdoms. The part that concerns us is the Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus I Nicator, one of Alexander's generals. The Seleucid Empire controlled most of the former Persian territory, Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and it was a Greek-ruled state governing a largely Iranian population. The Seleucid period is complicated. It is the kind of era that historians love and everyone else finds mildly confusing. Greek culture spread across the Middle East. Greek became the language of administration and high culture. Greek-style cities were founded. But underneath all of this, Iranian culture persisted. Iranian languages were still spoken. Iranian traditions were still practiced. Iranian identity didn't disappear. It just went underground for a while, like a river flowing beneath a Greek-paved road. The Seleucids gradually lost control of their eastern territories. They were stretched too thin, fighting wars on multiple fronts, dealing with internal squabbles, and generally failing to manage an empire that was too big for them. The eastern provinces started breaking away, and into this power vacuum stepped a new player, the Parthians. The Parthians were an Iranian people from the northeast, the region of Parthia, in what is now northeastern Iran and southern Turkmenistan. Around 247 BCE, a man named Arsaces led a revolt against the Seleucid governor and established an independent Parthian state. This was the beginning of the Arsacid dynasty, and it was the beginning of Iran reasserting itself after a century and a half of Greek domination. The Parthians were semi-nomadic in origin. They were exceptional horse archers. They had this infuriating battlefield tactic where they would ride away from the enemy, turn in the saddle, and shoot arrows backward while retreating. This was called the Parthian shot. And yes, this is where we get the English expression parting shot. The Parthians were so annoying to fight that they literally became an idiom. Over the next century, the Parthians expanded westward, gradually chipping away at Seleucid territory. By the mid-2nd century BCE, under King Mithridates I, the Parthian Empire controlled most of Iran and Mesopotamia. They captured Seleucia, the Seleucid capital, on the Tigris, and established their own nearby capital at Ctesiphon. The Seleucids were pushed back to Syria, and eventually faded into irrelevance. The Parthian Empire, also called the Arsacid Empire, lasted for nearly 500 years from roughly 247 BCE to 224 CE. And during this time, the concept of Iran as a cultural and political entity became stronger and more defined. The Parthians saw themselves as heirs to the Achaemenid tradition. They revived old Persian customs. They used the title King of Kings, just as the Achaemenids had. They were, in a sense, the first Iranian revival, the first post-Alexander assertion that this land had its own identity. Thank you very much. And it wasn't Greek. The Parthians also became Rome's major rival in the East. For centuries, Rome and Parthia faced each other across the Euphrates River, fighting intermittent wars, negotiating uneasy truces, and generally treating each other with a mixture of respect and contempt. The Roman general, Crassus, the richest man in Rome, the third member of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, invaded Parthia in 53 BCE and 53 BCE and was absolutely destroyed at the Battle of Carrhae. His army was annihilated. He was killed. According to one account, the Parthians poured molten gold into his mouth as a comment on his famous greed, which is either true or the most metal piece of ancient propaganda ever invented. The Parthian Empire was decentralized. The king was more of a first among equals, with powerful noble families controlling their own territories. This made the empire flexible, but also fragile. By the early 3rd century CE, the Arsacid dynasty was weakened by internal conflict and Roman pressure, and in 224 CE, a new dynasty arose from the same place as the Achaemenids from Fars. From Pars, the Sassanids. But we'll get to them in a moment. Let's let that sink in. Let's breathe. Feel the centuries rolling by. Feel the names and empires layering on top of each other like sediment. Achaemenids, Seleucids, Parthians, and now, something new. Something that will reshape Iran. Because they absolutely called it Iran. For the next 400 years. Alright, so, the Sassanids, around 224 CE. A man named Ardashir I from the province of Fars. There is that name again, Fars the gift, that keeps on giving, overthrew the last Arsacid king and founded a new dynasty, the Sassanid dynasty, named after Ardashir's grandfather Sassan, who was apparently a priest of some importance. Because in ancient Iran, even your dynasty's name has to have good provenance. No, here is what matters for our story. Ardashir didn't just see himself as replacing the Parthians, the true Persian, or rather Iranian, legacy. The Sassanids deliberately positioned themselves as the heirs of Cyrus and Darius, skipping over the Parthians as an interruption and the Greeks as an embarrassment. They were going back to the source and the Sassanid Empire. This is the key point, so file this one away. Explicitly called itself Iran Shah, the domain of the Aryans, the land of Iran. This isn't a modern invention. This isn't a retcon. This is right there in the Sassanid inscriptions, carved in stone, in Middle Persian Iran. Iran, the word was in official use during the Sassanid period, from the 3rd century to the 7th century CE. When someone tells you the name Iran is modern, they are off by about 1,700 years. Ardashir I was a capable ruler. He centralized power, far more than the Parthians had. He established Zoroastrianism as the state religion, which is a whole thing we should talk about, because Zoroastrianism is fascinating and also deeply relevant to Iranian identity. Zoroastrianism, the religion of Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, as the Greeks called him, it is one of the oldest monotheistic religions in the world, predating Christianity and Islam by centuries. It centers on the cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction and lies. Fire is sacred, as a symbol of truth and divine light. Zoroastrian temples maintain eternal flames. The faithful pray, facing fire. It is a beautiful, ancient tradition, and it was the spiritual backbone of pre-Islamic Iran. Under the Sassanids, Zoroastrianism became the official state religion in a way it hadn't been under the more religiously casual Achaemenids or the decentralized Parthians. There was a formal priesthood. There were state-sponsored temples. There was religious orthodoxy, and Zoroastrian identity became inseparable from Iranian identity. To be Iranian was to be Zoroastrian. At least, that was the ideal. Reality, as always, was messier. Ardashir was succeeded by his son, Shapur I, who was one of the most remarkable rulers in Iranian history. Shapur defeated 3 Roman emperors. He captured Emperor Valerian in 260 CE. The only time a Roman emperor was ever captured in battle. He supposedly used Valerian as a footstool when mounting his horse. Whether that is true or just really good trash talk, it is iconic. Shapur had his victories carved into rock reliefs at Naksh-e-Rostam, near Persepolis. There he is, on horseback, with the Roman emperor kneeling before him. It is the ancient equivalent of a victory lap selfie, and it is still there. You can go see it. It is right next to the tomb of Darius the Great, because the Sassanids very intentionally built their monuments next to Achaemenid ones. They were saying, we are them. We are the continuation. We are Iran. The Sassanid Empire lasted for about 4 centuries, from 224 to 651 CE, and during those 4 centuries, it was one of the 2 great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, and later, the Byzantine Empire, which was just Rome in a new outfit. The 2 empires fought constantly. They fought over Mesopotamia, over Armenia, over trade routes, over prestige. It was an exhausting, centuries-long rivalry that left both empires weakened. And this is important, because when a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, both empires were too tired to stop it. The Arab conquest. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Arab Muslim armies defeated the Sassanid forces. In 642 CE, at the Battle of Nahavand, they defeated them again, decisively. The Sassanid king, Yazgada III, fled east, trying to rally support, but was eventually murdered in 651 CE, reportedly by a miller, in Merv, which is about the most undignified end imaginable for the last king of a 400-year-old empire. It is like being the last emperor of Rome and getting taken out by a baker in Turkmenistan. And just like that, the Sassanid Empire was over. Iran was absorbed into the rapidly expanding Arab Islamic Caliphate. Zoroastrianism gradually gave way to Islam. Arabic became the language of religion, scholarship, and administration. The old world was replaced by a new one. Or was it? See, this is where the story gets really interesting, because Iran didn't just disappear into the caliphate. It was too big, too old, too culturally rich. The Arabs conquered Iran politically and religiously, but culturally Iran conquered right back. Persian language survived. It evolved from Old Persian to Middle Persian to what we now call New Persian, or Farsi. But it survived. Persian literature flourished. Persian art, architecture, and administrative traditions were adopted by the Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate, which replaced the Umayyads in 750 CE, was heavily influenced by Persian models of governance. The Abbasid capital, Baghdad, was built near the old Sassanid capital of Ctesiphon. Persian bureaucrats ran the Abbasid administration. Persian scholars contributed massively to the Islamic Golden Age. There is a famous saying, and I am paraphrasing, that the Arabs provided the religion, but the Persians provided the civilization. That is an oversimplification, and it is a bit unfair to both sides, but there is a kernel of truth in it. Iranian identity didn't die with the Sassanids. It absorbed Islam and made it its own. It kept the language, kept the literature, kept the sense of being a distinct civilization within the broader Islamic world. And the name, Iran, it never went away. No. Among the people who lived there, the Arabic geographers called the region Bilad Fars, the lands of Fars. But in Persian literature, in Persian poetry, in the collective memory of the people, it was always Iran. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings written by the poet Ferdowsi around 1000 CE, is a massive epic poem that tells the mythological and historical story of Iran from creation to the Arab conquest. It is written deliberately avoiding Arabic loanwords, and it is one of the greatest works of literature in any language. And it uses the word Iran constantly. Iran constantly, from Cyrus to the Arab conquest. from Zoroastrian fire temples to the dawn of Islam. And through all of it, the dual naming has persisted. Persia on the outside, Iran on the inside. Two names, one civilization. Continuing, we're about halfway through our story, and there is still so much gentle history to wade through. So, after the Arab conquest, Iran spent several centuries under various Islamic dynasties. There were the Umayyads, then the Abbasids. There were semi-independent Iranian dynasties that popped up when the caliphate's grip weakened. The Samanids, the Buyids, the Ghaznavids. Then the Seljuk Turks swept through. Then the Mongols came and absolutely devastated everything, because that is what the Mongols did. Genghis Khan's invasion in the early 1200s was catastrophic for Iran. Cities were destroyed, populations were massacred. Irrigation systems that had functioned for centuries were wrecked. It was not great. Then Tamerlane, Timur, came through in the late 1300s and did it all again, because apparently Iran just couldn't catch a break. But through all of this, Arab rule, Turkish dynasties, Mongol devastation, Timurid aftermath, Iranian culture persisted. Persian remained the literary language of a vast swathe of the Islamic world, from Anatolia, Persian poetry. Rumi, Hafez, Sazadi, Omar Khayyam became some of the most celebrated literature in human history. The Iranian identity never disappeared. It just kept adapting, absorbing, enduring. And then, in 1501, something happened that would define Iran right up to the present day. The Safavids. Shah Ismail I, a teenager, with an army of fanatically loyal Turkmen warriors called the Qizilbash, literally red heads because of their distinctive red headgear, conquered Tabriz and declared himself Shah of Iran. He was 16 years old, because nothing says stable governance like handing an empire to a teenager with a messiah complex. And Ismail did something dramatic. He declared Twelver Islam to be the state religion. No, this needs some context. Up until this point, Iran had been predominantly Sunni, like most of the Islamic world. There were Shia communities, particularly in certain cities, but Shiism was not NTZN, the majority faith. Ismail changed that. By force, in many cases, he essentially converted Iran from Sunni to Shia over the course of a few decades. He brought in Shia scholars from Lebanon, Bahrain, and Iraq. He imposed Shia practices. He persecuted Sunni religious leaders. This was, to put it mildly, a big deal. It created a distinct religious identity for Iran that separated it from the Ottoman Empire to the west, which was Sunni, and the Mughal Empire to the east, which was also Sunni. Iran became the Shia world, and it has remained so ever since. The Safavid conversion to Shiism is one of the most significant events in Iranian history. It is the moment when the modern religious identity of Iran was forged. Before the Safavids, Iran, culturally distinct but religiously similar to its neighbors. After the Safavids, Iran was both culturally and religiously distinct. It was a double layer of identity. Iranian and Shia, the two, became intertwined in a way that persists to this day. Ismail was eventually brought down to earth, metaphorically speaking, at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where the Ottoman Sultan, Selim I, defeated his army using superior firearms. Ismail's Chelbash warriors were brave, but somewhat underprepared for the reality of Ottoman cannons. Ismail survived, but was reportedly devastated by the defeat. He spent the last 10 years of his life increasingly withdrawn, drinking heavily, and rarely appearing in public. A common pattern for rulers who believe they're divinely inspired and then lose. Reality is a tough opponent. The Safavid Empire reached its peak under Shah Abbas I. Abbas the Great, who ruled from 1588 to 1629. Abbas was brilliant, ruthless, and paranoid, a classic combination for a successful monarch. He reformed the military, centralized the government, promoted trade, and built Isfahan into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The famous saying, "Isfahan is half the world," dates from his reign. The mosques, the bridges, the gardens, Isfahan under Abbas was a genuine wonder. Abbas also had a deeply troubled relationship with his sons, which is putting it charitably. He had one son executed and two others blinded because he feared they were plotting against him. Probably weren't. Or maybe they were. When your father is the kind of man who blinds his own children on suspicion, plotting against him starts to seem like a reasonable career move. After Abbas the Great, the Safavid Empire gradually declined. Subsequent Shahs were less capable. Some were actively incompetent. The court became increasingly decadent and disconnected. In 1722, Afghan invaders, not to be confused with the modern country of Afghanistan, exact Isfahan, and ended Safavid rule. The empire collapsed, and Iran entered another period of chaos, fragmentation. But the Safavid legacy endured. Shia Islam was now permanently embedded in Iranian identity. The concept of a unified Iranian state ruled by a Shah, distinct from its Sunni neighbors, heir to the ancient traditions of Iran Shah, was firmly established. The Safavids had taken the old idea of Iran and given it a new religious dimension. This is the Iran that would eventually become a modern nation-state. This is the Iran that would eventually demand the world call it by its proper name. But we're not there yet. We have to get through the 18th and 19th centuries first. And those centuries were rough. Let's float gently into the next disaster. After the fall of the Safavids, Iran went through a turbulent period. There was Nader Shah, a military genius from the Afshar tribe who reunited Iran, invaded India, looted Delhi, and brought back the Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. He was basically a walking loot crate, but he was also increasingly cruel and possibly insane, and he was assassinated in 1747. Then there was Khan Zand, who was actually a pretty decent ruler, modest, competent, and unusually humane by the standards of the era. He refused to call himself Shah, and instead used the title Vakil, Regent, which is kind of charming. He died in 1779, and his dynasty quickly fell apart, and then came the Qajars. The Qajar dynasty ruled Iran from 1789 to 1925, and if there is a dynasty that perfectly encapsulates the word dysfunction, it is the Qajars. They were a Turkmen tribal family who seized powers through military force and then spent the next 136 years slowly losing everything while looking fabulous, because the Qajars, whatever their failings as rulers, were committed to aesthetics. The portraits, the elaborate clothing, the truly magnificent mustaches. Qajar era art has a very distinctive look. Big eyes, curved brows, long beards, and mustaches that could support a family of smallie birds. The founder, Aga Muhammad Khan, was intense. He had been castrated as a child by a rival, which understandably left him with some unresolved anger issues. He was brilliant and ruthless, reunifying Iran through sheer force of will and selective brutality. He was also murdered by his own servants in 1797, reportedly after he threatened to have them executed in the morning. They decided not to wait for the morning. Understandable. His nephew, Fath Ali Shah, took over and had a famously enormous harem, and by some accounts, over 1,000 children. 1,000. That is not a family. That is a census. Fath Ali Shah's primary contributions to history were looking magnificent in portraits. Seriously, Google him. The beard alone deserves its own Wikipedia page. And losing 2 wars to Russia. The Russo-Persian Wars, 1804 to 1813, and then 1826 to 1828. Iran lost both. Badly. The Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828 forced Iran to cede vast territories in the Caucasus, basically everything north of the Aras River, including what is now Armenia, Azerbaijan, and parts of Georgia. These were territories that had been part of the Iranian world for centuries. Losing them was a national humiliation. And this is where things start to get really painful for Iran. The 19th century was the century when Iran went from being a major player on the world stage to being squeezed between 2 European empires, Britain and Russia, like a cushion between 2 elephants. The Great Game, as it was called, was the rivalry between Britain and Russia for influence in Central and South Asia, and Iran was caught right in the middle. Nasir al-Din Shah, who ruled from 1848 to 1896, is a fascinating figure. He was the first Iranian monarch to visit Europe, and he was absolutely dazzled by what he saw. He wanted to modernize Iran. He wanted railways, telegraphs, industry. But he also wanted to maintain absolute power and fund his expensive habits. So he started selling concessions to foreign powers. Mining rights, trade, monopolies, tobacco concessions. Basically, he was auctioning off Iran's economic sovereignty piece by piece. The most famous example is the Reuter concession of 1872, which granted a British businessman named Baron Julius de Ruyter sweeping control over Iran's banks, factories, minerals, railways, and other economic resources. Lord Curzon, the British statesman, called it the most complete and extraordinary surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom into foreign hands that has probably ever been dreamed of. Even the British thought it was too much. That is how you know you've gone too far. When the British Empire looks at your colonial concession and says, "Steady on, that is a bit much." The Reuter concession was eventually cancelled due to Russian pressure, but it set a pattern. Iran's rulers kept selling concessions, and foreign powers kept buying influence. The tobacco protest of 1891, where Nasir al-Din Shah granted a British company a monopoly over the production, sale, and export of tobacco, was a turning point. A nationwide boycott, supported by Shia clerics, the Shah to cancel the concession. It was one of the first times that the Iranian public and the religious establishment came together to challenge royal authority and foreign interference. Rehearsal, in a way, for what was coming. Nasir al-Din Shah was assassinated in 1896 by a follower of the pan-Islamic activist Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. His son, Mozaffar al-Din Shah, was a gentle, sickly man who was more interested in European spa towns than in governing. He was the Shah who, in 1906, under enormous public pressure, signed the decree establishing Iran's first constitution and parliament, the Marjals. This was the Shand constitutional revolution, and it was a massive deal. For the first time, Iran had something approaching a representative government. The Shah's power was theoretically limited by law. Theoretically, because in practice the new constitution was under threat from the start. Mozaffar al-Din Shah died almost immediately after signing it. His son, Muhammad Ali Shah, despised the despised constitution and in 1908 used his Russian officered Cossack brigade to bombard the Majles and shut it down. A civil war followed. The constitutionalists won. Muhammad Ali Shah was deposed. and his 12-year-old son, Ahmad Shah, was placed on the throne. Ahmad Shah was the last Qajar, and he was, by most accounts, a nice enough person who had absolutely no interest in or aptitude for ruling. He spent most of his time in Europe. He liked Paris. Who liked Paris can blame him. Paris is lovely, but while Ahmad Shah was enjoying French pastries, Iran was falling apart. The country was occupied by British and Russian forces during World War I, despite being officially neutral. Famine killed millions. The central government barely functioned. Provincial warlords did whatever they wanted. Iran was, by the early 1920s, a state in name only. Something had to give. And something did. Close your eyes if they're getting heavy. Take a slow breath. We're approaching the 20th century. And with it, the moment when everything changes. When the name on the international letterhead finally catches up with the name the people have been using all along. Here we are. The 1920s. Iran is a mess. The Qajar dynasty is on life support. Ahmad Shah is in Europe. The country is broke, divided and humiliated. British influence is pervasive. There is even the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919 would have essentially made Iran a British protectorate, though it was never ratified by the Magyars. Russia, now the Soviet Union, is poking around in the north, supporting separatist movements in Gilan and Azerbaijan. The central government in Tehran can't control much beyond Tehran. Enter Reza Khan. Reza Khan was a soldier, a big, imposing, no-nonsense military man from a modest background in the Alborz Mountains. He rose through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade, the same unit that had once bombarded the parliament. And in 1921, he led a coup. No, a particularly violent one by coup standards. He marched into Tehran with his troops, arrested a bunch of people, and installed a new government. He initially served as Minister of War, then as Prime Minister. The figurehead Shah Ahmad was off in Europe and barely noticed. Reza Khan was efficient. He was disciplined. He was utterly ruthless. He crushed provincial warlords. He suppressed tribal revolts. Strong, centralized leader that Iran's reformers had been calling for. But he was also authoritarian to his core. He tolerated no dissent. He accumulated power with the patience and inevitability of inevitability, rising water. By 1925, it was clear that Reza Khan was the real ruler of Iran. The Magyars formally deposed Ahmad Shah, who was still in Paris, presumably shrugging, and offered the crown to Reza Khan. Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, named after the Middle Persian language, Pahlavi, which was the language of the Sassanid Empire, because Reza Shah, leader before him, wanted to connect himself to that ancient pre-Islamic Iranian heritage. He was reaching back past the Qajars, past the Safavids, past the Arabs, all the way to the Sassanids, the Achaemenids, to the original Iran. And here, finally, we arrive at the name change. In 1935, Reza Shah issued a formal request to all foreign governments and diplomatic missions to stop using the name Persia and start using the name Iran when referring to his country. This was not a renaming. The country had always been Iran to its own people. This was a correction, an alignment, an insistence that the outside world use the same name that the inside world had been using for millennia. No. Why did he do this? There are several theories, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first, and most straightforward reason, is national identity. Reza Shah was a modernizer. and a nationalist. He wanted to project a unified, modern Iranian identity to the world. Persia was a neighbour imposed by outsiders derived from one province. Iran was the name the people used, derived from the ancient concept of Eren Shah. Using Iran internationally was a statement of sovereignty, self-definition. The second theory is more controversial. Some historians have suggested that the Iranian ambassador to Germany, Mohammad Ali Foraghi, or in some accounts, the suggestion came from the Iranian embassy in Berlin, was influenced by Nazi ideology and the Aryan racial theories popular in Germany at the time. Since Iran means land of the Aryans, the thinking goes, the name change was the name partly motivated by a desire to align with the Nazi concept of Aryan supremacy. No, this theory has some basis, but it has also been overstated and sometimes used to unfairly tar Iran. The word Aryan in the Iranian context predates Nazi ideology by about 3,000 years. The Iranians had been calling themselves Aryans since the time of the Achaemenids. The Nazis stole the term, twisted it. Iran shouldn't be blamed for using a word that was theirs long before it was abused. The third reason is modernization. Reza Shah was aggressively modernizing Iran, building railways, establishing a national education system, reforming the legal code, imposing Western dress codes. He banned the traditional chador for women and required men to wear Western-style hats. He was trying to transform Iran from a backward, semi-feudal state into a modern nation. Changing the international name was part of this broader project of reinvention. So, in 1935, Persia officially became Iran in international usage. Embassies updated their stationery. Mapmakers adjusted their atlases. The Times of London grumbled about it, as the Times of London does about everything. And gradually, the world got used to saying, Iran. But the story isn't quite that clean. Many people, especially in the West, continue to use Persia informally for decades. The language is still called Persian in English, or Farsi, which is the native term. The Persian Gulf is still the Persian Gulf, despite periodic attempts by some Arab countries to rename it. Persian rugs, Persian cats, Persian cuisine. The word Persian persists in English in all sorts of cultural texts. And in 1959, under Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Shah, the Iranian government actually announced that both names Iran and Persia could be used interchangeably. Name change wasn't as absolute as it seemed. But let's go back to Reza Shah, because his story isn't over. Reza Shah's modernization was real, but it came at a heavy cost. He was authoritarian. He crushed political opponents. He seized enormous personal wealth, including vast land holdings. He suppressed ethnic minorities, forcing nomadic tribes to settle and banning minority languages in education. He was, in many ways, the Ataturk of Iran, a secular modernizer who dragged his country into the 20th century, whether it wanted to come or not. And then World War II happened. Iran declared neutrality. Reza Shah was sympathetic to Germany, not necessarily to Nazi ideology per se, but to Germany as a counterweight to Britain and Russia, the two powers that had been meddling in Iran for over a century. He traded with Germany. He employed German engineers and advisors. He was not about to let the British and Soviets tell him what to do. The British and Soviets told him what to do anyway. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran. Just like that, the pretext was to secure a supply route to the Soviet Union, the Persian corridor, and to prevent Iran from falling into Iran, the German sphere of influence. Reza Shah's army, despite all his military investments, collapsed in days. he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Shah, packed off into exile, first to Mauritius, then to South Africa, where he died in 1944, lonely and bitter. A man who had remade a nation, exiled from it like a disgraced employee, and so the Pahlavi dynasty continued. But now under a much younger, much less experienced Shah. A Shah who would rule for nearly 4 decades, through the Cold War, through oil nationalization, through a CIA-backed coup, through rapid modernization, and ultimately through a revolution that would end his dynasty and transform Iran into something its ancient founders could never have imagined. But we'll get to that. Let's drift there slowly. Maha Pahlavi was 21 when his father was deposed, and he was placed on the peacock throne. He was young, insecure, and surrounded by powerful forces, the British, the Soviets, the Iranian military, the parliament, all of whom had their own agendas. For the first decade of his reign, he was largely a figurehead. Real power lay elsewhere. The most important event of this early period was the oil nationalization crisis of the early 1950s. Iran's oil. This is a whole saga in itself. Since 1908, when oil was first discovered in commercial quantities in Iran, the British had controlled it through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AOC, formerly the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The AIOC was enormously profitable for Britain. Iran got a pittance. The terms of the concession were, to use a technical historical term, absolute garbage. Iran received a tiny fraction of the profits. Iranian workers were treated poorly. The British lived in comfortable enclaves, while the Iranian oil workers lived in squalor. It was colonialism without the formal colony label. By the late 1940s, Iranian resentment toward the AIOC had reached a boiling point, and the man who channeled that resentment was Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a lawyer, a parliamentarian, and a passionate nationalist. He was also eccentric. He often received foreign dignitaries while lying in bed, in his pajamas, sometimes weeping. He was dramatic, committed to one cause, nationalizing Iran's oil industry, taking it back from the British. In 1951, the majors passed the Oil Nationalization Act and Mossadegh became Prime Minister. The ARO was expelled. Iran's oil leased a break. They imposed an international embargo on Iranian oil. They froze Iranian assets. They lobbied the United States. They tried everything short of invasion. The oil industry ground to a halt. Iran's economy suffered, and Mossadegh, for all his popularity, struggled to govern effectively in the face of economic collapse and constant foreign pressure. And then came the coup. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 carried out a covert operation, Operation Ajax. The Americans called it Operation Boot. The British called it, because the British are incapable of naming things without sounding like they're at a country fair, to overthrow Mossadegh. The first attempt failed, and the Shah actually fled the country for a few days. But the second attempt succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah was reinstated, and Iran's brief experiment with democratic nationalism was over. The 1953 coup is one of the most consequential events in modern Iranian history. It is the wound that never healed for many Iranians. It confirmed everything they had always suspected about Western interference in their country. It poisoned the relationship between Iran and the West for decades. And its echoes are still felt today in Iranian politics, in Iranian attitudes toward America and Britain, and in the broader Middle Eastern narrative of Western imperialism. Mohammad Reza Shah, now firmly in power with American and British backing, set about transforming Iran again, because Iran just keeps getting transformed over and over, like a house that has been renovated so many times. Nobody remembers the original floor plan. The Shah's modernization program was called the White Revolution, launched in 1963, It included land reform, women's suffrage, literacy campaigns, and industrialization. On paper, it was progressive. In practice, it was uneven. The land reform disrupted rural communities without always providing viable alternatives. Rapid urbanization created slums. The Shah's secret police, Savak, trained with help from the CIA and Israeli Mossad, ruthlessly suppressed dissent. Political parties were banned or co-opted. The press was censored. Torture was routine. The Shah also had a taste for spectacle. In 1971, he held an extravagant celebration at Persepolis, the ruins of the Achaemenid capital, to mark what he called the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great. Foreign heads of state were invited. The food was catered by Maxims of Paris. Tents were decorated with baccarat crystal and Limoges porcelain. The whole thing reportedly cost somewhere between $100 million and $200 million. In 1971 dollars. While much of the Iranian population lived in poverty, it was, in a way, the ultimate expression of the Persia-Iran duality. Here was the Shah, using the ancient name and ancient site of Persia to legitimize his modern Iranian state, while simultaneously alienating the very people he claimed to represent. He was performing Persia for the world while losing Iran at home. The opposition to the Shah came from many directions: leftists, liberals, nationalists, students. But the most powerful opposition came from the Shia clergy, and the most powerful voice among the clergy was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini had been a vocal critic of the Shah since the 1960s. He opposed the White Revolution, particularly its land reforms, which threatened religious endowments, and its granting of legal immunity to American military personnel in Iran. He was arrested in 1963, and his arrest triggered massive protests. He was eventually exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, and finally to France, where he continued to organize, speak, and build a revolutionary movement through cassette tapes smuggled into Iran. The original podcast, if you will. By the late 1970s, Iran was in crisis. Urbanization had created social dislocation. Savak's repression had created a culture of fear and resentment. The Shah's government was corrupt and disconnected. And then, starting in January 1978, a series of protests, strikes, and demonstrations began. They grew and grew, until, by late 1978, millions of people were in the streets. The Shah tried concessions. Too late. He tried martial law. Too heavy-handed. He tried leaving the country for medical treatment. He never came back. On the 1st of February, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile. He was greeted by millions. By April, a referendum had established the Islamic Republic of Iran. The monarchy was over. The Pahlavi dynasty, which had begun with Reza Shah's muscular modernization in 1925, was gone. And Iran was Iran. Officially, formally, emphatically. The Islamic Republic of Iran. No Persia. No. The Empire. No. The Kingdom. An Islamic Republic. Something entirely new, and yet built on foundations that were thousands of years old. The Revolution of 1979 was one of the most significant political events of the 20th century. It turned Iran from a Western, aligned monarchy into a theocratic republic. It sent shockwaves across the Middle East and the world, and it fundamentally redefined what Iran meant on the global stage. Under the Islamic Republic, Iran was no longer the glamorous, westernizing Persepolis celebrating of America. It was now something else entirely, something that defined itself in opposition to the West, something that drew its legitimacy not from ancient Persian kingship, but from sheer Islamic authority. The supreme leader, not the Shah, was the ultimate source of power. But even in revolution, the old patterns held. The Islamic Republic still called itself Iran, still used Farsi as the national language, still celebrated Nowruz, the Persian New Year, despite some initial clerical grumbling about it being a pre-Islamic tradition. Iranian identity proved, once again, to be deeper than any political system. Empires come and go. Dynasties rise and fall. Religions arrive and reshape the landscape. But the essential idea of Iran, the land, the language, the culture, the sense of being a civilization rather than just a country, persists. The Iran-Iraq War, from 1980 to 1988, dominated the first decade of the Islamic Republic. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, hoping to exploit the post-revolutionary chaos. What followed was 8 years of brutal, grinding warfare. Trench fighting, chemical weapons, human wave attacks, the targeting of cities. It was, in many ways, the Middle Eastern equivalent of World War I. 1 million people died. And Iran, despite the devastation, held. The war cemented the Islamic Republic's legitimacy in the eyes of many Iranians. They had defended the homeland. They had defended Iran. That word, after Khomeini's death in 1990s and the Islamic Republic, continued under a succession of supreme leaders and presidents. There were periods of reform, the Khatami era in the late 90s and early 2000s, and periods of hardline. There was the nuclear program, the sanctions, the diplomatic isolation. There was the Green Movement of 2009 when millions took to the streets after a disputed election, and the government cracked down with the same brutality that the Shah had once employed. The tools change. The pattern endures. And throughout all of this, the name question, Persia or Iran, continued to simmer in the background. In the West, Persia retained a romantic, Orientalist glow. It evoked ancient empires, poetry, and carpets. Iran, by contrast, became associated with revolution, hostage crises, and nuclear ambiguity. Same country, two very different associations. It is almost ironic. The name the Iranian people chose for themselves became, in Western media, a word associated with threat and conflict, while the name imposed by outsiders remained a word associated with beauty and culture. Some Iranian diaspora communities have leaned into this. You'll meet Iranian Americans who introduce themselves as Persian, precisely because it avoids the political baggage of Iran. It is a survival strategy, a way of saying, I am from a civilization with 3,000 years of history, not just the thing you see on the news. It is understandable, because the whole point of the 1935 name change was to reclaim the real name. And now, a century later, some Iranians abroad feel they have to give it back. At least socially, because the real name has been burdened with associations that have nothing to do with its ancient meaning. Iran, the land of the Aryans, the land of the noble people, older than Cyrus, older than the fire temples and the rock reliefs, a name that has survived Greek conquest, Arab conquest, Mongol devastation, colonial, exploitation, revolution, war, and the relentless turn of history. It is the same land, the same people, the same language, evolved but unbroken, the same identity, adapted but enduring. Persia was always Iran. Iran was always Persia. The two names are not competing. They're complementary. One is the outside view. The other is the inside truth. And the story of how one name gradually replaced the other in international usage is not really a story of change at all. It is a story of correction, of a civilization saying after 2.5 millennia of being mislabeled, actually, this is what we call ourselves. Please update your records. So here we are, at the end of a very long, very gentle journey. We started on the Iranian Plateau, with Neolithic farmers and migrating tribes. We watched the Medes rise and the Persians surpass them. We saw Cyrus build an empire and Darius organize it. We watched Alexander burn Persepolis and try to become Persian himself. We drifted through the Seleucids and the Parthians, those unsung 5 centuries of Iranian resilience. We marveled at the Sassanids, who carved Iran into stone and made it official. We watched the Arab conquest transform religion, but not identity. We listened to Ferdowsi recite the Shahnameh and keep the language alive. We saw the Safavids forge modern Iran with Shia Islam as its new spiritual core. We cringed at the Qajars selling the country piecemeal to anyone with a checkbook. We watched Reza Shah march into Tehran, found a dynasty, and tell the world it is Iran. It was always Iran. And then we watched it all keep going. Mohammad Reza Shah, Mossadegh, the coup, the White Revolution, the revolution, the war, the names, always the names. Persia, Iran, 2 words for the same ancient, complicated, beautiful, tragic, resilient place. The answer to the question how did Persia become Iran is both simpler and more complex than most people expect. The simple answer, the name change of 1935, was just the outside world catching up to what the inside world had always known. The complex answer is everything we've just talked about. It is the layers of empire and conquest and cultural exchange and religious transformation and political upheaval that make Iran one of the most fascinating civilizations in human history. It is a story that spans 3,000 years and involves every major force that has shaped the world, from the birth of empire to the rise of Islam to the Cold War to the age of revolution. And now, I hope you are sleepy. If your eyes are closed, keep them closed. If you are still awake, that is fine too. There is no wrong way to listen to this. The point was always just to be here, in this warm, quiet space, while history murmured in the background, like a river flowing past your window. The river is still flowing. Iran is still Iran. It always was. Good night, and thank you for listening.